Hello folks, has World of Warcraft become a bit too formulaic? And is that about to change? Since Shadowlands, World of Warcraft has launched with 8 new dungeons, with either a mega dungeon or in the War Within 2 additional dungeons being added later, along with 3 main raids, 1 per season. And since Dragonflight has also been launching with just 4 new leveling zones, and this has become a bit of a standard formula. It hasn't always been like this though. Both Legion and Battle for Azeroth launched with 10 new dungeons, and Legion gained not just a mega dungeon, but also 2 standard dungeons during its life. And both of those expansions came with 4 full-size raids, along with a mini raid. Going back even further in time, things become even less predictable. Up until Warlords of Draenor, it was not uncommon to have more than 1 raid in a season, especially at launch. And how many zones you could expect was anyone's guess. For example, Mists of Pandaria had 7 at launch, and Wrath had 10. Yes, there was a day when we get 10 new zones in an expansion. Of course, it's very tempting to look at those numbers and suggest that we're getting less and less these days, but that honestly would be pretty unfair. Zones are bigger in the modern era, and prior to Mists of Pandaria, we'd only once had a mid-expansion patch zone, that being Burning Crusade's Isle of Quel'Danas. And of course, since Season 4 of Shadowland, older dungeons are being brought back into service in the Mythic Plus season. But at the same time, if you had been asked to predict what would be in the War Within or Midnight before they were revealed, I would bet money that you would have predicted 4 zones, 8 dungeons, and 1 raid at launch. And for the War Within, you'd have been completely correct. But for Midnight, you're only partially correct. And when you start to look below the surface of Midnight, you start to see signs that those early predictions could perhaps be even further from the mark. And this does raise a bit of a question for me. Are Blizzard starting to look for ways to escape from the formula of the last few years? The most visible departure from the World of Warcraft formula is of course the raid, where in Midnight we're getting not 1 but 3 raids at launch. The last time we had more than 1 raid in a single launch season or tier was back in Mists of Pandaria with Mogashin Vaults, Heart of Fear and Terrace of Eternal Spring. But that was 14 years ago. So there is now no doubt that for raiders, the start of Midnight is going to feel very different. Something that will be the most visible when it comes to the race to World First, who will have to figure out how to approach the 3 raids and indeed what the finishing line for the race, or perhaps multiple lines, will end up being. Now, in my view, the raiding scene has been feeling a little bit stale of late, with especially the high end of Mythic raiding having been on an admittedly very slow decline since the heights of Shadowlands Castle Nathria. So seeing the World of Warcraft team trying to shake things up is very welcome. And it will not just be the race that is going to have to make some decisions about what raids to do and when. Even your average curve guild is going to have to figure out how to balance those multiple options when it comes to the middle of that first season of Midnight. And I personally do wonder if those smaller raids might end up making Mythic raiding feel a bit more approachable for many guilds. With the player base aging, the demands of work and families does make the traditional 2 nights plus an alt raid formula harder for many players to commit to, and I suspect that the idea of 1 night a week raiding may start to appeal to a much wider audience. Now, at first glance, when we look beyond raiding, the rest of Midnight does kind of still seem a little bit stuck in that more traditional formula, with 8 new dungeons and 4 new zones. And when it comes to the dungeons, that I think is very true. And in fact, Blizzard in developer interviews has confirmed that for Mythic Plus, their plans are to continue the now long-term approach of only making smaller organic changes from season to season, rather than a big bang expansion style rework. But when I take a deeper look at the open world and beyond those 4 leveling zones, that's where we again start to see many signs of deviation from the traditional formula. Because here's the thing, we're not getting just 4 zones with 1 capital city. Player housing is the main back of the box feature of Midnight, and this is bringing with it 2 additional full-size zones, Founders Point and Razorwind Shores. Now for sure, you're not likely to be doing very much questing or leveling in these zones, but that's kind of the point. These are very, very different zones from the standard World of Warcraft fare. These are ones that are designed to last for many expansions into the future, instead of just being played for a single expansion and then relegated to being of interest only to legacy content collectors and low-level alts needing to level up. The very nature of player housing means that these are zones that are going to be visited for long into future expansions. I personally do expect that one day we will see some more housing zones being added, but that's not going to mean that we'll all be encouraged to en masse move our homes to the new shiny. Instead, these zones I think are going to gain a similar status to Stormwind or Orgrimmar as being a place that remains relevant from expansion to expansion. And the extra zones don't stop there. The big surprise of the most recent Midnight Deep Dive was Argentina. Now this isn't of course a true open world zone. Instead, it's quite a large communal space designed to provide a fresh alternative to the expansion hub cities for players to congregate, socialise and gain access to outdoor world content options in a completely fresh way. But it is one that is adding in top of those more traditional zones. And in those developer interviews, the dev team have shared that they do see this as a vehicle that will continue to remain relevant in future expansions. And this, I think, at least if these new features turn out to be successful, is a far more significant change than many of us realise. Ever since the launch of Burning Crusade, the launch of a new expansion has seen the World of Warcraft dev team funnel the player base into the shiny new expansion areas, rendering the previous content largely irrelevant beyond leveling, and transforming previously bustling cities and zones into spaces that feel like they're basically abandoned shopping malls. As the World of Warcraft has grown, this effect has over time become exacerbated. Today, if you level up in older continents, you're going to be doing it alone, as the world is so vast and so irrelevant that the chances of you encountering another player is close to nil. And this gives new and returning players an impression that the game is basically dead. Pretty much since the start of Dragonflight, we've been hearing the word evergreen being mentioned in developer interviews, but the only truly evergreen features that we've seen have been Exile's Reach and the updated Shadowlands version of the Mage Tower. But even that latter feature is so hidden away in the broken shore that for newer players, it might as well not exist. But between player housing and Argentina, it is starting to feel to me like we're seeing the first early signs of the dev team starting to deliver that evergreen content and moving away from the long-term approach of building out content to last only 2 years, after which it ends up abandoned. And that is especially the case when it is taken in the context of getting the first fully updated expansion leveling zone, Eversong Woods, that we've seen since Cataclysm, with more likely to follow in the Last Titan. And it's not only a shake-up in the open world zones. Again, pretty much since Burning Crusade, expansion level up storylines have been divided by zone, with each zone having a largely self-contained story. But in Midnight, it does look that the World of Warcraft team are also planning to shake up that format. While the 4 leveling zones do still all have their campaign and side quest stories, that is not all we can expect to get, as there's actually a 5th storyline. This storyline involving Illyria and Turalian's son Arathor is presented to us as a peer of those other zonal stories. And in fact, at one point we will get a choice between Zulaman, Harendir or the Arator storyline, which we'll be able to do in any order. And this brand new 5th storyline will be taking us on a journey that spans not just Eversong Woods, but goes into the Eastern Plaguelands, where we'll be visiting places like Light's Hope Chapel and Stratholme. Now, it is not unheard of for us to be very briefly taken to visit old zones. Legion did this in the high-class Order Hall campaigns, for example, but those were very much blink and you'll miss it events. At the time of recording this video, the Arator story isn't available for testing, but all the indications from the developers are that this is a much bigger storyline that will very likely see us spending more time outside the shiny new midnight zones than we've been used to in the past. My understanding is that part of the development team's reluctance to put new content in the older zones has been due to concerns about visual fidelity, and of course the fact that those zones are kinda stuck in the past, the immediate aftermath of the Cataclysm in most cases, and their willingness to set this new story in the Eastern Plaguelands does give me some hope that the developers are starting to get over those worries, or at least are willing to experiment to see how we react to changes like this, which potentially, I think, could lead us to seeing a lot more of this type of innovation in the future. As an enjoyer of World of Warcraft's open world, I am for sure very much up for that. The world of Azeroth is massive, and being hemmed into a tiny island in a tiny corner of the planet does seem kind of a bit of a waste to me. One question that is very much top of my mind is what may this end up meaning for the future of World of Warcraft. Ever since Dragonflight, we've been seeing World of Warcraft content being released at an ever faster and faster pace, and there has never been more to keep us busy in-game. And whenever I step back from it all, I do start to wonder where this might be leading. When I look at the max level competitive content, the game has become increasingly seasonal, with a season typically lasting 5 months. And while the start of those seasons is still very closely aligned with major patch releases, the volume of content we're getting in some of those minor patches is anything but minor. And more, I've been starting to feel that the open world content is starting to get disconnected from that competitive gameplay. World of Warcraft veterans have always explained to new players that the real World of Warcraft only arrives at max level, that being of course raiding and dungeons. There have always been players who ignored that stuff and made do with just the open world content, but for the longest time that very much felt like being a second class citizen. But that is no longer the case. Between Delves, the new prey system, and the possible addition of multiple difficulty levels to the open world, along with all of that patch content, and the reality is that the fourth pillar of endgame, open world content, is second class no longer. The seasonal model for the competitive pillars of the game is for sure here to stay, and the major changes to the game's release schedule has enabled those seasons to become a lot more consistent in duration, ending up around 5 to 5.5 months, with no more weird multi-year long droughts. But I am starting to wonder if the development team may be gearing up to more completely disconnect the non-seasonal content from that seasonal release cadence. And that is leading me to another thought. Is the day coming where perhaps the traditional model of getting a new World of Warcraft expansion every 18 to 24 months might be coming to an end? As we move into a world where older zones are being revamped, patch content is no longer limited to the lifespan of a patch, and even the smallest minor patches have as much to do as certain older expansions did at launch, well, expansions have a place to play in the future of World of Warcraft. Now, for sure, expansions do have a part to play for the next couple of years. Midnight is coming real soon now, and The Last Titan, barring some disastrous misstep by the dev team, is definitely still on the calendar. But beyond that, might we eventually see ourselves move into a world where we get new competitive seasons every 5 months, and the open world making do with just getting larger and more diverse content patches every 2 to 3 months. Now, I know exactly what you're typing in the comments right now, that expansions make far too much money for Blizzard for them to drop them. But is that really true anymore? In the past, there was for sure a cycle where the launch of a new expansion would see a massive spike in player numbers, which would last maybe 2 to 3 months, after which a sizable chunk of them would quit until the next expansion. But the indications from both Dragonflight and The War Within is that those spikes simply don't happen anymore. But at the same time, thanks to investor reports and data from Raiding and Mythic Plus participation, we can also see that the players who are there at the start of those expansions are much more likely to stay for the entire duration. Without a launch spike at the start of a new expansion, all an expansion does is pull in the equivalent of an extra 6 months or so of sub revenue. And there are other ways to get that money. I mean, have you noticed the now monthly releases of cash shop bundles, which seem to be costing as much as 2 to 3 months of a sub price? Now, of course, only Blizzard can know if that will ever happen. And as a lover of the initial expansion level up experience, I'm not even sure that I would want it to happen, but it could solve a few problems for the game, such as the need for level squishes, or that early expansion dead zone for competitive players who face 2 to 3 weeks with no access to raiding or Mythic Plus, not to mention the way that they're forced to level up when they really don't enjoy that content. Or indeed that feast and famine approach to story delivery, where the first 30% of a story gets 80% of the player time, with the remaining 70% invariably feeling super rushed. And on top of that, removing the need to level up every 18 months or so would remove a major source of item level inflation, which would very likely reduce the frequency of item level squishes by quite a bit. For a change like this to succeed, the dev team would have to make some very major changes, likely offering the storyline at a much slower pace, but with much larger servings, and even minor patches. But here's the thing, I'm sure I'm not the only one who's been noticing the very significant increases in storyline content in those mid-expansion patches. Just a thought. But what about all of you? Do you think that we might be heading down a road that is leading to the end of World of Warcraft expansions? And if we do, would this change work for you? Let me know in the comments down below. If you found this video helpful, entertaining, or even just plain annoying, then let me know by hitting that like icon. And if you want to support my channel to grow and help me to make more of these videos, along with my other content, then hit that subscribe button right now before you forget. And if you don't want to miss out whenever I release a new video, then as well as subscribing, you can follow me in social media for updates. My link's in the description below as well. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.